Okay, right, let's talk about trust for a moment. You know, that warm feeling you get when a company tells you that their product is environmentally friendly, fuel efficient, and perfectly legal. Well, I've got a story that's going to make you think twice about believing anything a car manufacturer tells you about emissions. You've probably seen the ads, but this is the story of Dieselgate, how Volkswagen, one of the most respected car companies, programmed their vehicles to cheat on emissions tests while pumping out up to 40 times the legal limit of toxic pollutants on real roads. We're talking about 11 million cars worldwide that were essentially mobile poison factories disguised as clean, efficient vehicles. And when I say programmed to cheat, I don't mean they bend the rules or found a loophole. I mean, they literally wrote software code designed to detect when the car was being tested and switch to a completely different, cleaner mode. The moment the test ended, the cars went back to belching out illegal levels of nitrogen oxides that cause respiratory disease, heart problems, and premature death. Hey, I'm Andy Roberts. This is the fine print, where we read the corporate code so you don't have to breathe the consequences. This isn't just a story about cheating on tests. This is a masterclass in corporate deception, where a company's entire business model was built on a lie and millions of customers paid premium prices for cars that were slowly poisoning the air that they were breathing. To understand how Volkswagen pulled off one of the biggest corporate frauds in automotive history, you need to understand the problem that they were trying to solve. You see, in the 2000s, diesel engines had an image problem. They were seen as dirty, smoky, sluggish things, better suited to lorries than family cars. But diesel engines are genuinely more fuel efficient than petrol engines. They also produce less CO2, which was becoming increasingly important as governments started caring about climate change. The problem was nitrogen oxides, NOx, a nasty group of pollutants that cause smog, acid rain, and serious health problems. Volkswagen saw an opportunity. What if they could make a diesel engine that was clean, efficient, and powerful? They could market clean diesel technology and capture customers who wanted to be environmentally responsible without sacrificing performance. The marketing campaign was brilliant. VW promised cars that delivered excellent fuel economy, low CO2 emissions, and met all environmental standards. Their slogan in America was "Clean diesel? Believe it." They positioned themselves as the thinking person's choice, sophisticated European engineering that was good for your wallet and good for the planet. American celebrities bought into it. Environmental groups praised VW's clean diesel technology. The cars won awards for being green. VW's diesel sales in the US, where diesel passenger cars had basically become extinct, started climbing steadily. There was just one tiny, itsy-bitsy little problem with this clean diesel revolution. It was physically impossible, at least with the technology VW had. So here's where the story gets a little bit technical, but please bear with me because this is crucial to understanding what happened. You see, making a diesel engine that's powerful, fuel efficient, and genuinely clean requires expensive tech. You need a sophisticated exhaust treatment system, high-quality catalysts, and an additional fluid system that adds weight and complexity to the whole car. The proper way to reduce NOx emissions involves something called selective catalytic reduction. Basically, it sprays urea solution into the exhaust to neutralize the pollutants. But this requires a whole separate tank that needs to be regularly refilled, and it adds cost and adds complexity, and it also slightly reduces the fuel efficiency of the car. VW engineers are facing at this point an impossible triangle. Customers want power, efficiency, and low price. Regulators also demanded low emissions. Now you can have two of these things, but not all three, at least not with the budget constraints that VW had set. So they chose a fourth option: lie. The solution was a piece of software called a Deceit device. When the car's computer detected it was being tested, based on various factors like vehicle speed, wheel position, engine operation, atmospheric pressure, etc., it would switch to a special test mode. In this mode, the exhaust treatment system worked overtime. The engine ran less efficiently and emissions dropped to legal levels. However, the moment the test ended, the car switched right back to its normal operation. Power increased, fuel economy improved, and NOx emissions shot through the roof, sometimes reaching levels 40 times higher than the legal limits. Now, if you're thinking, surely someone would have noticed that these cars only ran clean during very specific conditions, you are absolutely right. And if corporate fraud this systematic makes your blood boil, hit that subscribe button, because this is exactly the kind of deliberate deception that shows how far companies will go when profits matter more than public health. The Deceit device was incredibly sophisticated. It didn't just flip a switch. No. It gradually transitioned between test and real-world modes to avoid detection. The software monitored dozens of parameters to determine when the car might be undergoing emissions testing. It was engineering genius applied to criminal fraud. Installing Deceit devices wasn't some rogue engineering decision either, oh no. It was a corporate strategy that required coordination across multiple levels of VW's organization. The software had to be developed, tested, approved, and installed in millions of vehicles across multiple model years. VW didn't just cheat on tests, they built an entire mythology around their clean diesel technology. They published technical papers explaining how they'd solved the diesel emission problem. They gave presentations at environmental conferences. Their engineers received awards for their breakthrough technology. When independent research started questioning VW's emissions claim, the company didn't come clean. Instead, they doubled down. They issued technical bulletins explaining why real-world emissions might be higher than test results. They blamed environmental factors, driving conditions, testing methodologies. The cover-up expanded to regulatory interactions. When the California Air Resources Board started investigating unusual emission patterns, VW sent teams of engineers to explain why their cars performed differently in real-world conditions. They provided technical justification that sounded somewhat plausible, but they were completely fictional. VW even continued selling and marketing their diesel cars for months after regulators had identified serious problems. They issued voluntary recalls for software updates that they claimed would improve emissions performance, knowing full well that the real problem was intentional fraud built into the car's fundamental design. The company also worked to suppress independent research that might expose their deception. They pressured testing organizations, challenged unfavorable studies, and used their influence in industry associations to shape emissions testing standards in ways that benefited their fraud. The beginning of the end came from an unlikely source, a small research organization called the International Council on Clean Transportation. In 2013, they wanted to demonstrate how clean American diesel cars had become. So of course, they commissioned West Virginia University to test VW diesels on real roads. The results were baffling. The cars that performed beautifully in laboratory conditions turned into pollution monsters on actual highways. One VW Jetta exceeded NOx limits by 15 to 35 times. A Passat was even worse, pumping out 5 to 20 times the legal limit. Initially, everyone assumed there was a testing error. VW certainly suggested as much, providing explanations about why real-world conditions might produce higher emissions. They issued that voluntary recall for software updates, claiming it would address any anomalies. But the researchers weren't satisfied. They kept testing, and the results kept showing the same massive discrepancies between laboratory and real-world performance. More importantly, they shared their findings with the California Air Resources Board, which had the authority to investigate further. The California regulators weren't buying VW's explanations either. They threatened to refuse certification for VW's 2016 model year diesels unless the company provided satisfactory explanations for the emissions discrepancies. Faced with the prospect of losing access to the lucrative California market, VW finally admitted the truth in September 2015. Not to the public, mind you, no. Not in a press conference, but in a very quiet meeting with regulators. They revealed that they had installed Deceit devices in approximately 11 million vehicles worldwide. The admission was devastating. VW's stock price collapsed, losing a third of its value in days. Regulatory agencies around the world launched investigations, criminal prosecutors started building cases, and millions of VW owners Well, they were mad, realizing they'd been driving cars that were systematically poisoning the air when they believed they were helping the environment. Now, unlike many corporate scandals, Dieselgate actually produced some meaningful consequences. The financial penalties were staggering. VW paid over $33 billion in fines, settlements, and remediation costs. In the United States alone, they faced $14.7 billion in civil settlements, $4.3 billion in criminal fines, and billions more in buyback programs and environmental remediation. But the real shock was the criminal accountability. VW executives actually went to prison. Oliver Schmidt, who had been VW's point person with American regulators, was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Other executives faced legal charges in Germany, though the German criminal justice system proved less aggressive in pursuing convictions. The human cost was also significant. Studies estimated that the excess NOx emissions from VW's cheating cars caused between 1,200 and 4,200 premature deaths in Europe alone. In the United States, the environmental damage was calculated to cost billions in healthcare expenses and environmental remediations. VW was forced to buy back nearly 500,000 diesel cars in the United States at pre-scandal prices, costing the company billions. They also had to invest $2 billion in electric vehicle charging infrastructure as part of their settlement agreement, essentially being forced to help build the technology that would replace their fraudulent diesel engines. The scandal destroyed VW's diesel business in key markets. Diesel passenger car sales in the United States, never large to begin with, essentially disappeared. European consumers who had embraced diesel technology for decades started abandoning it in favor of petrol and electric alternatives. Perhaps most importantly, Dieselgate accelerated the automotive industry's transition away from internal combustion engines. The scandal demonstrated that traditional automakers were willing to lie about environmental performance, making electric vehicles seem more trustworthy by comparison. The Dieselgate scandal revealed several uncomfortable truths about how modern corporations operate. First, it showed that environmental regulations are only as good as the enforcement mechanisms behind them. VW was able to cheat for years because testing regimes were predictable and easily gamed. The scandal also demonstrated how corporate culture can normalize fraud. This wasn't the work of a few rogue engineers. It required coordination across multiple departments, countries, and years. Hundreds of VW employees knew about the Deceit devices, and almost all of them stayed silent. Most disturbingly, Dieselgate showed how companies can use technical complexity to obscure fraud. VW's deception was hidden in millions of lines of computer code that regulators and consumers had no practical way to audit. As cars become more computerized, the potential for this kind of hidden fraud only increases. The scandal should have led to fundamental changes in how automotive regulation works. Instead of predictable laboratory tests, regulators should have implemented random, real-world testing. Instead of trusting manufacturers to self-certify their vehicles' compliance, there should have been independent verification systems. Some of these changes did happen, but slowly and incompletely. The European Union did eventually implement real-world emission testing, but it took years and the standards are still weaker than what environmental groups recommend. American regulators increased their oversight, but they still rely heavily on manufacturer testing and certification. The Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal represents a new kind of corporate fraud, one hidden not in accounting, tricks, or misleading marketing, but in the computer code that increasingly controls our lives. VW's cars were programmed to lie, and their lies were invisible to everyone except the engineers who wrote them. This isn't just about cars or emissions or environmental regulations. It's about what happens when corporations can hide their deception in technology that's too complex for regulators, customers, or even their own employees to understand. Every day, we interact with devices and systems controlled by software we can't examine, written by companies with their own interests. Our phones, our cars, our appliances, they're all running code that could be doing things their manufacturers don't want us to know about. VW showed us that a company could systematically lie for years through software, affecting millions of customers and causing thousands of deaths, all while maintaining a reputation for engineering excellence and environmental responsibility. They proved that in the age of computer-controlled everything, corporate fraud can be literally programmed into the products we buy. But if you think programming cars to cheat emissions tests is shocking, wait until you hear how pharmaceutical companies programmed doctors to overprescribe addictive painkillers. The Sackler family engineered a whole nationwide addiction crisis by turning physicians into unwitting drug dealers, and when the bodies started piling up, they used bankruptcy courts to protect their billions. Watch that story next and see how corporate programming can be far more deadly than anything hidden in a car's computer.